In this episode of Radio Free Humanity, we talk to Adam Plante, who is a student in New York City who works with Marxist-Humanist Initiative researching authoritarianism and democracy. We chat with Adam about a paper he presented at last year's Historical Materialism Conference in New York, a paper entitled To Defend and Transcend Liberal Democracy. In the conversation, we chat about the need for socialists to fight to defend liberal democracy from the full-on assault of authoritarian threats like Trumpism. It is a wide-ranging conversation, moving from the critique of soft-on-Trump leftists to a conversation about the 2020 elections, to a theoretical discussion of the way in which socialists can both fight to defend and transcend liberal democracy. You are listening to Radio Free Humanity, the Marxist-Humanist podcast. My name is Brendan Cooney.
And this is Andrew Klein.
To hear more episodes, read more about the issues discussed, or to join in the conversation, please visit Marxist-Humanistinitiative.org. You can also make a donation there on the website. While our podcast is hosted by Marxist-Humanist Initiative, the views expressed by the co-hosts and guests of Radio Free Humanity are their own. They do not necessarily reflect the views and positions of Marxist-Humanist Initiative. In just a moment, we'll be talking with Adam Plante about defending and transcending liberal democracy. But first, as we do in every episode, we're going to take a few moments to talk about some current events. We are recording this current events section on February 12th, the day after the New Hampshire primaries, and we're going to be talking about the current state of the Democratic primaries and what this means for the fight against Trumpism. I'm suspecting we're going to hear a lot of celebrating today and in days to come about Sanders' victory in New Hampshire, and probably claims that this is further proof that Sanders is the strongest candidate to beat Donald Trump. But I suspect we should be taking those kind of claims with some skepticism. For one, Sanders' victory in New Hampshire was a lot narrower this time around than it was a few years ago when he ran against Clinton in New Hampshire, and that might reflect the fact that there are more candidates to choose from. But also, if you were to take the sort of two left economic populist candidates, Warren and Sanders, take their votes on one hand, and everyone else who voted for, Klobuchar, Biden, Buttigieg, the sort of more centrist candidates on the other hand, it's clear that there are a lot more votes for the centrist candidates than for the left populist candidates. My suspicion is that means that although someone like Sanders might do really well in the primaries because the sort of centrist vote is divided amongst lots of candidates, when it comes to the general election, I worry that there will not be the same enthusiasm for Sanders, and a lot of people will be scared of his candidacy and wish they had a different candidate to vote for.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the major point that it's very unsettled, and the victory of Sanders was narrow, just like the victory in Iowa of Buttigieg over Sanders a week before was same degree of narrowness. The one thing I would urge caution about is this idea that the primary voters are themselves in lanes, the progressive lane versus the moderate lane, and are choosing candidates on the basis of that kind of ideological split. I mean, first of all, even people who vote in primaries who are much more keyed into politics than the average person in the population, even they are not primarily ideological voters. They don't have the kind of political sophistication, as it were, to think about the issues in those ways. So I think that preferences cut across all kinds of possible divisions. And there's a lot of factors involved. And what makes it even more complicated this time, much more complicated this time, is it's just like what John Maynard Keynes called the beauty contest problem, and he applied it to the stock market. Like in the stock market, if you want to do well, you don't just pick a company that you think is going to thrive. Okay, you pick a company that you think that other people think is going to thrive, because then you can resell the stock for more. Or a company that you think other people think that other people think that other people think, He says he knows of people who are able to take this, 5 degrees of separation or whatever the term is. Okay, from everything I'm hearing on the news, a lot of that kind of stuff is going on in primary votes. So it's not even people voting on the basis of their own preferences. They're voting on what they think other people's preferences are and who's the most electable and, who can defeat Trump and all of this. I mean, I've heard some pretty funny things like young people in general, are not kindly disposed to Pete Buttigieg. But because he's young, a lot of older people think that young people are going to like him, so they start to vote for Buttigieg. I mean, so the whole thing is a complete mess. And the other thing is, if you want to know who's going to succeed and who's going to not succeed, you got to look at the state of the campaign's finances because that matters. I mean, especially when you come up to something like Super Tuesday, where there's a lot of big states, and they're all having primaries at once.
Okay, point taken. One of the things that distinguishes Sanders more from his rivals is his fanatical base, a base which has even been compared to Trump's base in terms of their level of fanaticism. It still mystifies me, given the fact that, Elizabeth Warren is basically an identical candidate. With just a few differences of labeling. She calls herself a capitalist. He calls himself a democratic socialist.
But in general, you look at all of these candidates, and really, the ideological differences between them are really, really minor. You say that from the outside. I mean, if you're talking about a Methodist and a Presbyterian, they think they've got big differences, right? It's the same thing. I mean, I couldn't tell them apart, right? From the outside, it's like, what are these people fighting about? But look, even insiders are really upset about this, as well as people like myself, and it seems like a lot of the whole population is saying, look, the thing that we have to do is get rid of Trump, and everything else is peanuts compared to that. That's the one thing we have to deal with. And, and they're talking about Medicare for all who want Medicare for, really minor things when basically you got Mitch McConnell in control of the Senate. You're not even going to have Obamacare. So
I think I'm probably not alone in fearing that if Sanders wins the nomination, a lot of people will potentially not vote for Sanders and either abstain from voting or vote for Trump because they perceive him to be a greater threat, whether or not that's realistic or not. And that if Sanders loses the Democratic nomination, a lot of Sandinistas may sit out the election or vote for Trump or vote for a third party, like happened last time around, or throw the election for Trump. And there'll probably be lots of conspiracy theories circulating, encouraged by Trump's propaganda machine to encourage Sandinistas not to back the Democratic nominee.
I agree with you, and I mean, it's not Sanders' doing. That was like the big takeaway from his victory speech yesterday is, he emphasized how important it was to get rid of Trump and that he would support the nominee, whoever it is, and the rest of them would do the same. So that's not the problem. The problem is Bernie Sanders' followers. You wonder to what extent they're actually his followers, or, they've got their own agenda, and he's the vehicle for their agenda in many cases. So, right, I mean, there's a small group of people who their main goal is to take over the Democratic Party, destroy the centrists, the moderate liberals, and even people like Elizabeth Warren. And to them, that's more important than getting rid of Trump. And that's the people like Ted Rawl who we've talked about. So Bernie Sanders for them is a vehicle, and their aims and his don't mesh entirely. It's much like with the situation with Trump's base. Trump is a vehicle for these people. It's not like actual cult hero worship, as much as anybody says that. I mean, if Trump wasn't, ripping apart immigrant families and everything, if he wasn't giving these people what they want, they wouldn't stick with him. It's very transactional, and that's how I regard it with Sanders' base as well. I mean, there's nothing that I think he can do about it. I mean, there's just a small group of people. And the problem is, although they're small, this matters. And it mattered in 2016, not with respect to Sanders so much, although probably there were some Sanders people who sat out the election and so forth. But the vote received by Jill Stein in the 3 states that flipped to Trump, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, the vote received by Jill Stein was bigger than Trump's margin of victory in each of those states. So it's a small group of people, but their decisions do matter a lot.
Yeah.
Another thing that has to be said with respect to the primaries is how just absolutely disappointed and feeling that shut out so much of the Democratic Party feels. And I'm referring to like people of color, especially like black and Latino. I mean, because there are no remaining candidates who are black or Latino, and the only remaining person of color, I guess, is Tulsi Gabbard. You don't have Cory Booker, you don't have Kamala Harris. You don't have Julian Castro. And then you get 2 extremely white states, Iowa and New Hampshire. They have basically put the candidacy of Joe Biden put it in serious danger. And he's been very popular among black voters, in particular older black voters. And at the end of this month, there's going to be a primary in South Carolina, heavily black Democratic primary vote, expected to go well for Biden if he's able to last that long. But that's the problem. By the time these folks get a chance to cast a ballot, so much is already water under the bridge. So people of color are like 40% of the Democratic Party vote. And, a lot of them are just feeling shafted for very good reasons. And, so now you've even got I'm hearing talk of it. I don't know how much of this is real, but you're hearing, black people considering shifting their preference from Biden to Mike Bloomberg, who's a Republican. Was in New York, he was our mayor, Republican mayor, and he aggressively enforced these stop and frisk policies, and he says now that it was wrong, But, it's not like they don't know that he did this. They don't know that he's bad news. But for black people in this country, it's not like a matter of, here's what we want. Let me vote my values and my aspirations. It's like our lives are on the line, and if it's a choice between Donald Trump winning and somebody like Bloomberg being able to win, right, versus, I don't know, Bernie Sanders being able to lose or whatever, we don't want Bernie Sanders if he loses. We'll have to go for Bloomberg. And I mean, this I find very, very disturbing, that people whose lives are really on the line and for whom these decisions really matter don't even have equal voice, much less preferential voice determining what happens. So, I mean, I think people who are really affected, you should listen to what they have to say, and it's just, it's not about you. It's about their futures as well, but it's not the way these things operate, unfortunately.
And that is it for our current events section today. Next up, our interview with Adam Plante.
Okay, so Adam, last year, the Marxist-Humanist Initiative held a panel at a conference in New York City, sponsored by the journals Historical Materialism and Jacobin, and you gave a presentation. And I was struck by the way you began your presentation. You said that the election of Donald Trump and the rise of other authoritarian strongmen around the world is a dire threat, not just to the liberal democratic order, but also to socialist values. And I was struck by this because, in one sense, it's like very obvious. It's always been obvious that authoritarianism is a dire threat to socialist values. After all, the socialist movement arose in opposition to monarchies and autocratic states. And the socialist movement has, for a very, very long time, fought hard for the expansion of freedoms and democratic rights. So what I was struck by is why you felt the need to emphasize something so obvious. Why did you find it necessary to emphasize the threat of authoritarianism to socialist values specifically?
Really, it struck me that this didn't appear obvious to so many people, especially when it came to the question of Trump. There were a lot of people who saw Trump, not necessarily as a friend, but as somebody who could come in and shake things up in America and create space for socialism, rather than doing the standard authoritarian spiel of rolling back protections and persecuting, political opposition. So it just really struck me that people saw that they could make common cause with Trump, or even use the rise of authoritarianism to further the socialist project, rather than authoritarianism being completely anathema to that project.
Give us an example. Where did you see this happening?
Well, one of the striking ones was the article that Slavoj Žižek wrote, I believe, for The Guardian, entitled "Don't Believe the Liberals. There's no real choice between Le Pen and Macron." That was in 2017. However, this is an attitude. MHI has pointed out a lot of stuff with Chris Catrone, who, at first he said, "Why not Trump?" And then after he was called out on that, he still wrote an article that was mostly about anti-Trumpism and how that's a distraction from socialism and the socialist project. But this underlying idea really, really struck me, that there's no real choice between neoliberalism or the liberal democratic order and authoritarianism. And I really started looking at that, especially around this time before the Historical Materialism Conference. I had been reading Lenin's State and Revolution, and it just really struck me that after 90 or so pages of critiquing the liberal democratic order, he said in something I quoted in that piece, that liberal democracy is of enormous importance to the working class in the struggle for socialism. And that really stood out to me, because despite, heavily criticizing liberal democracy, he didn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And it also struck me that, okay, this question isn't as abstract as I just phrased it. I think it's very concrete. The authoritarians are rolling back the protections that are offered to minorities in the working class. I mean, in my talk, I mentioned that Trump threatened basically every institution and value of democracy. He threatens the rule of law, as we just saw with the impeachment trial. He threatens the freedom of the press. Actually, I just read an article today where the Committee for the Protection of Journalists, which typically tries to protect journalists in foreign countries, authoritarian countries, and countries which are currently war-torn, they just issued a safety kit for the 2020 election in the U.S. He's also threatened the legitimacy of fair and free elections. He's, absolutely destroyed the separation of powers and the oversight function of Congress. Political pluralism is really under threat here. I could go on and on. So these are really concrete, assaults on the protections that democracy offers us, that a lot of leftists are either looking the other way on, or more often, especially now that it's so obvious that Trump is just a disaster to any semblance of freedom in this country, that they still downplay it. They still downplay the threat of Trumpism.
Why do you think that is? Why have so many people tried to downplay all these dangerous aspects of Trumpism?
Well, first, I want to kind of clarify what I mean by this. It's not just downplaying it, it's also normalizing it. It's very common for people to say, for people on the left to say, oh, well, Obama also separated children from their families, without getting into the actual details of what the no tolerance policy was, which made that the default case rather than, an exception where civil deportation hearings were completely eliminated under Trump, whereas before they at least happened under Obama. There's plenty of examples of this, how much of a warmonger Hillary would have been, So the idea that there's some sort of spectrum, that Trumpism is basically the same as what came before, as what the neoliberal status quo or whatever is, really, really shocked me. So I'm not exactly sure why people are normalizing the indefensible. However, I think it has to do with this whole broken record crap about neoliberalism, that they already have certain commitments in place that they are unwilling to give up, so that Trump is a threat to neoliberalism, and that therefore we can make common cause with Trump because he threatens the neoliberal order, rather than threatening life on earth or the freedom of this country, the freedom of the people in this country.
I actually think that it's not at all obvious that Trump threatens neoliberalism. In his presidential campaign, he said he would protect Medicare, he would protect Social Security. He says lots of things, but we know he's a liar. If you look at his actual record, it's one of deregulation. It's one of massive tax givebacks to corporations and to the wealthy. You get people such as there's Henry Giroux, the education theorist, who talks about, Trumpism as neoliberal fascism. And I mean, I think it's just he's trying to split a difference or something. I don't think that category works very well. But I'm not so sure that Trump threatens neoliberalism, and therefore therefore the soft on Trump left is soft on him because he's a threat to neoliberalism. I think it's more you were saying that they can make common cause, or they think that they can use Trump for their projects. It seems to me that the issue is more that if the focus is put on defeating Trump and Trumpism, the centrality of their struggle against neoliberalism kind of has to take a back seat. And I think that might be what threatens people. I used to hear a lot, but this is a distraction. What we have to deal with is, neoliberalism and the billionaires and the this and the that and the other thing. And, don't get distracted by Donald Trump. My reaction to that was always the kinds of things that you folks are talking about in this moment. These things seem to me to be a distraction from the urgent crisis that we face because of Trumpism. And, that's what we have to put front and center. I don't know. How do you feel about that, Adam?
When you put it that way, I'm really struck by the contradiction that's underlying that argument. I have Chris Cotrone's piece, Why Not Trump, from September of 2016 right in front of me. And he says that everything Trump calls for exists already. Yet the other side of that argument is that Trump is supposed to shake things up. And I agree with you that on the one hand, he's supposed to threaten the neoliberal order, but on the other hand, he's just an extension of it. And I think that's really a contradiction that's underlying it. And, I think that instead of acknowledging that contradiction, it allows them to do double duty. On the one hand, everything Trump calls for exists already. So, he's just as bad as the liberals. He's just, Macron is just as bad as Le Pen. Hillary is just as bad as Trump. So they can downplay the threat that authoritarianism plays, while at the same time saying that even though there is that false equivalency there, they can also say, with the other side of that argument, that it'll shake things up. And so that allows them to conclude, on the one hand, that neoliberal centrism is no different from authoritarianism, but at the same time, anti-Trumpism is the problem and obstacle, and not Trump. He's not all that extreme, and that this is a distraction from the socialist project because we're just picking from one billionaire or another.
Yeah, this idea that he's not so extreme. I mean, now after 3 years of him in power, it's very hard to make that argument. It has become increasingly hard to make that argument about him not being so extreme. But I remember before the election, this is campaign talk and blah, blah, blah. We don't know. There's no track record, and there's no reason to believe that, this guy would be falling if he became president. Now we know this guy is falling all around us. Why do you think that threat that Trump represents and Trumpism represents was just not recognized sufficiently at first, or maybe it just wasn't taken seriously enough at first?
Frankly, I think it's because it wasn't a threat to them, to their own person. The people who are saying this are not, the Hispanics who he immediately tried to turn the entire country against, or the Muslims who he banned from the country. Or one of the most shocking examples of this was when one of his lackeys, Katrina Pearson, went on television and said that the rights afforded by the Constitution only apply to U.S. citizens. I think part of it comes from a position of privilege where they aren't the ones who are under attack yet by Trump, so that they aren't taking the threat seriously. On the other hand, I think there's a bit of navel gazing here too, where again, they're not taking him as a threat because they see that they can make common cause with him. They see that he's going to, maybe he's not going to attack neoliberalism, but he's going to destabilize it and shake things up such that, socialism could be around afterwards to pick up the pieces when he either utterly annihilates the Democrats or just destroys the fabric of this country. So I think there's a bit of annihilationism in there too.
Yeah, and I think there are some people on the left that are just not used to and not willing to find common cause with liberals or centrists. And frankly, some of the people making the most noise against Trump in this country are people from the political center, or liberals who are concerned about preserving the rule of law and protecting the rights of disenfranchised and minorities and protecting democracy. And leftists, some people on the left are not used to fighting common cause with those sorts of concerns. They just know how to critique the ideology of liberalism or the ideology of the political center. They went and got fancy degrees in philosophy so they could unmask the fetishism of capital. But there's really no need for Lacan or the Frankfurt School to stand up to Trumpism, because Trumpism is kind of just so obviously bad and dangerous on its face. There's no mask involved, so there's no role for the Chris Cutrones and the Slavoj Žižeks. They have nothing to offer this political moment. And so I think they just want to sort of pretend that it's a different political moment, and there's still this need for their sort of smarty pants deconstructionism. And I also think that some of these people they consider themselves too hip and cool to be caught dead at something like the Women's March or watching Rachel Maddow. They're like the kids that are too cool to sit at certain tables in the high school cafeteria, no matter what. And then there's also the we've already sort of hinted at in this conversation, the sort of narrow economistic left populists who all they're really concerned about is taking over the Democratic Party and advancing this social democratic agenda, and they think this is their moment. And they just view this Trumpism as a distraction from what they think is the real political moment, and that's the taking over of the Democratic Party with this sort of social democratic politics. And there's a real danger that we're just going to have a repeat of the debacle that the Labour Party just suffered in the UK, where they also wanted to treat Brexit and Boris Johnson as a distraction to their political agenda, and they campaigned just on National Health Care Service, and they got a serious beatdown because that was not actually what the political moment was about. The political moment was about the rise of authoritarianism and reactionary politics on the global stage.
Yeah, I think you're right. A victory against Trump, in their view, would not be a victory for this sector of the left. It wouldn't be a way in which they seize mass support or political power. It would simply be a defeat of Trump, creating a vacuum, handing power over to the Democrats, something of that effect.
I think one example of this would be the sort of absurd level of reaction and vitriol against Rachel Maddow that one found in certain parts of the left in recent years that I think didn't have a real rational basis. It was just because her star was rising and she was getting a lot of attention because of her journalistic investigations of Trump and the Trump organization and her following of the Mueller investigation, all of which I think were important things for reporters to be reporting on. But, she's not a radical. She's not a leftist. She's not writing for Jacobin. She's not a Democracy Now! Reporter. And so some people on the left were just, really upset that the political attention was being diverted away from their agendas. And it wasn't, she's not out there talking about single-payer healthcare or, inequality. She's reporting on, like, the crimes of the Trumpism and the dangers of authoritarianism. And didn't fit into the narrative that the left populists want to paint of what they think the political issues are of our time. But this reaction against her popularity turned into this sort of absurdist post-truth denialism when you have leftists, trying to say that there was nothing wrong with, there is no Russiagate and that there is no story here about Trump's criminality and authoritarianism.
Yeah, this discussion caused me to go back on the internet and find this ridiculous column I read by Ted Rall, who's a very well-known cartoonist, does political cartoons. And he's your kind of like dyed-in-the-wool anti-neoliberal leftist. And he November 7 last year, he wrote a column called, "For Progressives, Capturing the Democratic Party is More Important Than Beating Donald Trump." And he begins the following way. He says, "Nothing leading Democrats say matters more than beating Donald Trump. 2020, they argue, is the most important election of our lifetimes." Okay, they always say that. Continues, "It's not true. If you're a progressive voter, taking back control of the Democratic Party from the DLC, Democratic Leadership Council, Clinton, Biden, centrist cabal is more important than defeating the incumbent." And he goes on. But, I mean, basically, yeah, let's do everything we can, to destroy the Democratic Party in order to, risk destroying the Democratic Party in order to get Bernie Sanders in, whatever it is, even at the risk of, having 4 more years of Donald Trump. Okay? I mean, that shows you the priorities very clearly, it seems to me. A lot of times people hint around the edges at this. This guy just comes out and says it. Okay, so that raises for me a question. Okay, this kind of response to Trumpism from some sections of what calls itself the left, just sitting idly by or egging Trump on or defending him, minimizing, saying it's a distraction. I mean, that is harmful. It's harmful to immigrants. It's harmful to refugees, to black people, to other people of color, etc., etc. But Adam, you've been arguing that it's not just harmful to like the rest of us, it's also harmful to that so-called left itself. You say it's suicidal. Why? What's your argument as to why, they're actually hurting themselves?
When I said that it was suicidal, I meant that in a couple of ways. On the one hand, I think it's playing with fire to look the other way on and even encourage the rise of the far right. What happens when the far right is on the rise? Democratic institutions, norms, and protections are rolled back. Protections against the police, protections against the state, free elections, a free press. All of those things are crucial to the socialist project being able to operate at a fuller capacity. Without a free press, spreading ideas and having open discussions about what revolutionary politics should be becomes very difficult. Without free elections, look at what happened in Hungary. They were able to rewrite the constitution in 2010, and now, sure, they have elections, but they're the furthest thing from fair or free. They're a complete farce. Minority rights, civil liberties, people are actually under attack when those are rolled back. So on the one hand, I think it's very dangerous, not just politically, but concretely, with the protections that democracy allows leftists, so that to some extent the revolution can be agitated for out in the open, that there are protections against arbitrary exercises of power by the police and by the state. When I said that was suicidal, what I meant was that, on the one hand, it threatens to remove a lot of the protections that offer leftists some amount of ability to agitate for the revolution out in the open. The freedom of the press, minority rights and civil liberties, protections against the arbitrary exercise of power. So on the one hand, it threatens the political liberties that allow leftists to function. On the other hand, it also threatens leftist values to elect and agitate for the enemies of freedom. It absolutely undermines the values of people who are fighting for human liberation to elect people who are completely against human freedom. And finally, I use the word suicidal because in some cases, electing the far right very well is suicidal for leftists. People get jailed, people are imprisoned arbitrarily. People have their newspapers seized, their ideas censored, and in some cases they're executed. So it's suicidal in several senses, and I think it says a lot about people's values who call themselves leftists that they could even entertain this idea.
Adam, I don't know if you can answer this, but do you think that there's a difference between different age brackets in regard to the prevalence of this sort of soft on Trump leftism? Is this something that's more prevalent amongst the younger generation?
I'm not sure. I think that with older people, they've seen what happens under Nixon, Reagan, McCarthyism, etc. in this country. So I think older folks already have kind of seen this thing before, and so they're less likely to not take it seriously. I think perhaps that's part of it. With a lot of young people too, especially in my generation, when we're coming of age, this was in the wake of the Great Recession. So I think there's a lot of hopelessness. There's I would even say most people in my generation feel like we've been lied to, that promises have not been kept, that the quality of life that we have and the opportunities that we have are worse than those of our parents. Crippling debt, coming out of college, and finding a terrible job market, or at least one that is not offering great opportunities. I can't tell you how many people I know in my generation who are working in Uber Eats or something. So I think there's a sense of betrayal and a bit of hopelessness hopelessness there, so that, I think younger people are perhaps willing to turn to left and right authoritarianism, either because they feel like there's nothing worth salvaging and they can burn it all down and start over, because they're angry, or simply because they've kind of checked out. And that's just with sectors on the left. I think there's also a real appeal by these far right demagogues to young people. That there really is, it's not a huge sector of young people who are flocking towards Trump. His numbers with young people aren't that great. However, the ones who are flocking to Trump, who are my age, are absolutely dedicated. What worries me is that the young people who are flocking to Trump are the most energetic in many cases about him. They're the ones who are running the white supremacist blogs, podcasts. They're the ones who are propagandizing, both in word and in deed. They're the ones who have pioneered live streaming terrorism. They're the ones who have pioneered using the internet to spread hateful ideologies in a way that made Stormfront obsolete almost immediately when they came out. That's what's really frightening to me too. So I think there are a lot of factors which are contributing to young people having a sense of hopelessness or anger, or even in many cases just outright embracing fascism, or in many cases just outright embracing the far right.
Well, Adam, you are a young person relatively, and you have not fallen into the traps of soft on Trump leftism or the sort of narrow economism of the Jacobin left populist Sandinista crowd. So what has allowed you to be immune to those things?
I wasn't really deeply involved in leftist circles until Trump began to show his ugly face. And I think that's certainly part of it. When I became politically active in leftist circles, was coincided with the rise of Donald Trump. And so I think it was from the start, it was a little more focused on anti-authoritarianism rather than this more traditional social democratic platform of trying to seize political power. So I think that's part of it. Honestly, I can't tell you, because this is just so obviously wrong, and it's so obviously wrong that even liberals get it, and it just shocks me that so much of the left doesn't. I understand that they might be tepid about making common cause with liberals, but not when it's the far right, man. It just astounds me that this isn't obvious to people, that attacks on every sort of minority and civil liberty you can name, attacks on every democratic institution and cultural value and norm, attacks on the truth. These things are just so obviously wrong that I don't know. I don't think that the question is, why did I buck the trend? The question is, why haven't these other people done that? Why is that the trend?
I think that's a very good way of putting it, but I don't know the answer, right? You seem to be an anomaly, whereas you should be the norm. And it's like, why is this not the norm? Why are you an anomaly here?
Well, maybe we'll have some people with great insights, and they will write into our podcast and give us some good answers in the comment section.
I mean, this is an issue for the whole world, because this goes exactly to Vladimir Putin's game plan. Vladimir Putin's game plan is, okay, I'm a strongman dictator, but the promises of democracy are hollow. They've always been hollow, and what I'm going to do is show the world that nobody's really different. That you want to get along in life, you keep your head down, you stay clean, you don't buck people in power. You get somebody who cares about the people, and you support them wildly, and they'll make sure that you're not executed or something. And that's all you can really hope for. That's what he's trying to do, make that message come across around the world, by messing up countries like the United States. I mean, he's done a tremendous job of showing how hollow the democratic core institutions are in this country. I mean, right now, tomorrow, the Senate's going to acquit Trump, in the impeachment trial, and there's probably not going to be any Republican votes to remove him at all. And it basically says, okay, he's above the law. He can get away with anything. And his lawyer, Dershowitz, supposedly a Democrat, came out with that argument that basically if he believes that his election is in the common interest, the interest of the people, it's in the national interest, then it doesn't matter what he does. He can extort other countries to manufacture evidence on his political opponents, because that's in the national interest. I mean, the state is me, that's the authoritarian position. And And if Putin has done nothing else, he's made it clear that this is the actual thinking that is now guiding the Republican Party, not only Donald Trump, but him as well. So when you get this lack of concern, disillusionment with liberal democracy from large sections of the population, it's very concerning, because that gives the things that Putin are doing, that Trump is doing, it gives them, a mass power, a base. There's some material reality underpinning this. And, I can understand why that's coming from the far right. What I don't understand at all are the supposedly leftist manifestations of the same thing. How, I really find it very hard to understand why some people think that, like, Medicare for all is something to fight for, but saving, liberal democracy is not. I mean, that's not what Bernie Sanders thinks. He doesn't know kind of how to combine the two things into something coherent. For him, it's on the one hand and on the other hand. But there are a lot of people, sort of grouped around his campaign and sympathetic to it, who really seem to think that, like, we can jettison liberal democracy, and that's completely fine as long as, we got the Medicare for all, the, no college debt, the free college tuitions, and stuff like that. I find it very hard to understand that. But I don't know, maybe you have some insight into that.
I mean, I suppose Medicare for all would be nice under authoritarianism. We might need it. For me, the question is really, okay, so, the premise I think that I do buy is that part of the rise of far-right sentiment and authoritarianism and the subsequent democratic backslide is caused by, this cynicism with the failures or the contradictions of democracy. The contradiction of these egalitarian principles, these views that all men are created equal. And then on the same page of that document, it says that black people are worth 3/5 of a person. These contradictions are really in the DNA, I think, of a lot of these liberal democracies, of these republics and constitutional monarchies across the globe. So the question for me is, okay, so if this cynicism indeed leads to people turning away from democracy and towards authoritarianism, that I can buy. The thing that so many sectors of the left do with that, though, is they tweak that. They say that the cynicism is caused not by capitalism, not by the contradictions of capitalism, not by the contradictions of liberal democracy, but by neoliberalism. Therefore, under the current order, therefore neoliberalism and democracy and capitalism are all equated and actually really reduced to neoliberalism. And that therefore fighting for democracy, which is equated to neoliberalism, is the same as, or really not preferable to, fighting against authoritarianism, because if neoliberalism causes authoritarianism, why would you fight to defend democracy? Because democracy is neoliberalism. This epiphenomenal view of the rise of the far right, I think, is extremely dangerous. And I was shocked by how clearly this was phrased in the Zizek piece I mentioned earlier on "Don't believe the liberals. There's no real choice between Le Pen and Macron." And at least in the U.S., it's not the case that economic dissatisfaction with neoliberalism led to the rise of Donald Trump. I get that logic, but I mean, I can understand why people who a priori are concerned with only fighting neoliberalism and not fighting capitalism. I can understand why they would then fall into the trap of basically supporting the far right. But even then, when I went into the ballot box, when I went into the voting booth in November of 2016, I took one look at Trump on the ballot box next to Pence, and it made me sick. There's a picture from the French election that really has always stood out to me, and it's two campaign posters next to each other, one for Macron and one for Le Pen. And somebody had taken spray paint and spray painted a $sign over Macron's face and a swastika over Le Pen's face. When the choice is that stark, when the choice is that clear, door number one, the $sign, or door number two, the swastika, I still don't see how people can fail to see the real difference between the two. I understand that the logic of their argument goes that neoliberalism neoliberalism causes, the far right or the rise of the far right. But even then, that doesn't mean vote for the far right. You could very well just vote for neoliberalism and then try to agitate further left. So I still don't understand the choice to minimize or actively defend the far right, because if there's no difference between the two choices, why prefer the second one? So that's the thing I don't get. Even if you follow the logic of this epiphenomenal argument that that the rise of the far right is a symptom of neoliberalism, which has caused discontent with democracy, why does that mean that you minimize authoritarianism? Why does that mean that actually Zizek said, in the French election, Zizek said don't vote because there's no real choice, but in the American election he was like, oh yeah, I like Trump.
Yeah. And Chris Cutrone encouraged people to vote for Trump and voted for Trump himself and bragged about it. So it's not just, we're not just talking about hypotheticals here. We're talking about actual people that call themselves Marxists and leftists and socialists, and they went out and voted for Trump or encouraged people to vote for Trump as a way to say fuck you to Hillary Clinton, because they saw her as somehow the embodiment of all evil.
I mean, the argument that there was no choice between the National Front and a centrist like Macron. Okay, first of all, to say that neoliberalism, leads to the far right, which in a sense it does, I find it hard to understand how one moves from that to the idea that there's no choice between them. Just as you say, at the moment that there's an election, there's the one versus the other, and you can say this led to that, but that doesn't mean that they're identical. In fact, it means that they're not identical. If there's this and that, it means that they're not identical. But what struck me when I recently reread this piece in the Independent, May 3rd of 2017, by Zizek, he ends it by saying, he says, what vision has the left to offer that would be strong enough to mobilize people? And he says, we should never forget that the ultimate cause of the act that we are caught into, the vicious cycle of Le Pen and Macron, is the disappearance of the viable leftist alternative. So the ultimate cause of all of this is the disappearance of the viable leftist alternative. So if you're going to say that neoliberalism leads to the ascendancy of the far right, you have to say, along with Zizek, and he says it, he admits it right at the end, the ultimate cause here that leads to neoliberalism, which leads to the ascendancy of the far right, is the disappearance of the viable leftist alternative. So if you want to say, the real underlying cause here, you can't just implicate the neoliberals, you have to implicate the left for not being able to put forward a viable alternative. And then if you want to take the step and say the one thing leads to the other, so there's no difference, you're not only saying there's no difference, there's no choice between neoliberalism and the far right, now you've got no difference between the left and the far right.
Yeah, it's helpful that you point out that part at the end, because it's not just that neoliberalism causes the far right or the ascendancy of the far right. It's that the lack of a viable left has created space for neoliberalism, which leads to cynicism with democracy and the rise of the far right. So what this is the lack of a left ultimately means that you should vote for the far right.
Well, they don't come out and say it, but that's the logical implication of it.
I mean, part of it, I think, for people like Zizek and Cutrone is that they don't really have positions. They just exist as sort of entertainment figures. They say provocative things that make people say, oh, well, I hadn't thought about that, or, whoa, that's even more radical than I thought. They want to find like these clever ways to deconstruct things and expose things and make people see like behind the veil of ideology and expose the fetish and things like that. So they don't really have to take responsibility for things they say. It's just sort of like this evocative deconstructionist art or something, and the people like them because it makes them feel smart. It's like little coy one-liners you can say at a bar conversation with your other grad student friends and sound like you're even more free-thinking or something, So Cutrone can say a bunch of sort of impressionistic things about how the Democrats are just as bad on this or this issue, as if it's like brilliantly piercing like the veneer of liberalism and all the ideology of liberalism. But it's really, it doesn't come across as impressive or intelligent anymore. It just comes across as asinine and pathetic, like some kind of old clown trying to repeat some routine that doesn't work anymore in like a modern era. There's just no possible way you can conceivably equate neo-fascism with sort of the centrist neoliberals. There's just no conceivable way that intelligent people who haven't already imbibed the Kool-Aid of some like leftist cult organization like the Platypus Society. There's no way normal people who can see reality with their own eyes clearly are going to equate these two things. Only like crazy people on the left who have something to prove are going to make these kind of arguments. Hey, in just a moment, we're going to continue this conversation, but first, we're going to take a moment to tell you a little bit about Marxist-Humanist Initiative, the organization which sponsors our podcast.
Hello, this is Anne Jacquard, Organizational Secretary of Marxist-Humanist Initiative. Marxist-Humanist Initiative, or MHI, aims to contribute to the transformation of this capitalist world by projecting, developing, and concretizing the philosophy of Karl Marx and its further development in the Marxist humanism articulated by Raya Dunayevskaya. We are not a political party, nor are we trying to lead the masses whose emancipation must be their own act. But we have seen that spontaneous actions alone are insufficient to usher in a new society. We seek a new unity of philosophy and organization in which mass movements striving for freedom lay hold of Marxist philosophy of revolution and recreate society on its basis. Today's political, economic, and environmental crises present a moment to engage people in discussion of these ideas. MHI is dedicated to the task of proving theoretically that an alternative to capitalism is possible. We are distinguished by our economic analyses, which demonstrate that the only opposite to the current world economic system is its abolition and replacement with one not based on the production of, quote, value. Because capitalism cannot be fundamentally reformed, attempts to reform it lead to an intensification of state capitalism, not socialism. MHI's ideas and actions, as well as our structure and rules, are guided by the interests of working people and freedom movements, of people of color, LGBTQ people, other minorities, youth, and all those around the world who are struggling for self-determination in order to freely develop their own human natures. We have no interests separate and apart from theirs. We intend to practice, as well as espouse, a two-way road between our organization and people outside it as essential to developing a single dialectic in the relationship of theory to practice.
So I'm pretty struck by something that Engels said to the International Working Men's Association in 1871. This was a talk he gave on September 21st. And he said, right at the very end of it, this is the last paragraph, quote, "The political freedoms, the right of assembly and association, and the freedom of the press, those are our weapons. Are we to sit back and abstain while somebody tries to rob us of them? It is said that a political act on our part implies that we accept the existing state of affairs. On the contrary, so long as this state of affairs offers us the means of protesting against it, our use of these means does not signify that we recognize the prevailing order." That seems a lot more clear-headed than saying, oh, Hillary is just as bad as Trump, and therefore it's okay that one of Trump's main agendas is to roll back our protections even more than some of the Democrats have been. So, just to get a cheap shot at the libs, we're going to give up our political freedoms.
Right. I mean, I really hope that Brendan is right and no normal people will fall for this kind of like irony, postmodern relativism, or whatever you want to call it anymore. I mean, this is the way that Trump got himself elected in 2016, and it's clearly the game plan that he's using into trying to smear Joe Biden, the creating of false equivalence. And if you just keep repeating, her emails, because her emails, but her emails, and, Hunter Biden, and you can kind of neutralize the corruption issue. So, Trump is a horrible, corrupt monster, but the other side is just as corrupt. So, let's vote about what we really care about. Given that they're both corrupt, who's the white nationalist? Who's more of the misogynist? Who's going to give me my tax cuts and keep the fetuses alive? Right? That's the game plan. And I mean, I hope that people don't fall for it, but you can't really live on hope. I think that Trump knows how to play to people's fears, and he knows how to neutralize the opposition. And a lot of people hate, politicians and all the old story. Oh, they're all corrupt, and this is Trump just makes it more on the surface, whereas the other people hide it. I'm very worried that people are still going to fall for it. I mean, whataboutism is basically just totally illogical, but people fall for it.
Yeah, and I think the other big question, open question, is whether or not we're going to see a recurrence of the Bernie or bust mentality that contributed to Trump's victory in 2016, and whether the Sandinista crowd will have learned anything from that debacle, or we're just doomed to repeat the same mistake again.
I mean, I think that's the other side of it. It's not just, can Trump cause enough confusion, but also, we're already seeing the Bernie or bust crowd repeating itself. When he was pitted against Warren, I think actually a lot of Bernie supporters would never go with Warren after that. The Des Moines Register poll, I've seen a lot of conspiracism around that. Bernie was supposed to be way up in the polls, and that was why it was suppressed, and it was another CNN hit job, just like the Warren thing. I think we're already seeing the Bernie or bust narrative being written, and probably even more sharply than last time. I think I really can't see a significant portion of Bernie people going with another candidate if they feel that the nomination's been stolen from them. I saw a poll today where it was Yang supporters, I believe it was 40% total, that would either not vote for any other candidate, or it would depend on the candidate if it weren't Yang. Bernie's numbers were the second highest, but not quite that high. I think that the Bernie or bust narrative is already being written right in front of our eyes, and this abstentionism, Bernie or bust, vote third party, it's going to be even worse this time, I think.
Yeah, we're in a very dangerous situation because on one hand, we have this phenomenon where there's such a religious cult of personality around Sanders in some circles that a lot of those people might vote a third party or not vote, or vote for Trump or something again if Sanders doesn't get the nomination. But on the other hand, if Sanders gets the nomination, there are going to be a lot of people who consider Trump the lesser of two evils because they perceive Sanders to be some sort of dangerous socialist candidate, no matter how inappropriate that label is. And I really don't think a lot of those Jacobin, Sandinista, Social Democrat folks really fully understand how dangerous a game it is they're playing.
Well, first of all, when you say the Sandinistas, I mean, Sanders himself has been pretty clear that, and, I heard Andrew Yang when the same statistic about only half of his voters would vote for a Democratic candidate and the other half would not vote if he doesn't become the nominee. He says, no, the main thing is to defeat Donald Trump. That's what he said. But the problem is the people that are supporting the candidate. And with Sanders, it's the same thing. Sanders is very clear, and I think he'll, if he doesn't get the nomination, I think he'll do a lot to go around speaking and telling people to defeat Trump. The problem is really the supporters of the candidate. They've got their own agenda. Certainly the people at Jacobin and the DSA have their own agenda, which is not the same as that of the candidate that they're backing. I just read you what Ted Raw had to say. There are these people who think that the main struggle is against the centrist in the Democratic Party, etc., and the struggle against the far right and white supremacy and virulent misogyny and putting immigrants in cages and separating their families, that's just a distraction. There are people who think this. So this goes back to the central question of Adam's work, where he raises this issue of socialist values. I'm just wondering whether we're trying to deal with people who don't have empirical disagreements with us, such that we can discuss the facts and, maybe they could persuade us about some facts and we can persuade them. But these are people whose values are just unlike, if not antithetical to ours. And there's just nothing to say that they represent, a different politics because they've got entirely different goals and aspirations. I've come, to this point where that's what's on my mind as to whether that's the issue. It's like you can't really talk to people who you don't have anything in common with. I would like to hear from both of you what you think about that.
One possible alternative that comes to my mind is that, again, it all boils down to left verstism. It boils down to this strategy of, using freedom struggles as a vehicle to seize power for oneself and one's program. So given that, perhaps that's what's motivating the normalization of and tendency toward the normalization of the far right and the tendency towards even minimizing it or supporting or outright supporting it, because the alternative more often than not is a centrist. So, because this sector of the left is motivated by the desire to seize political power, of course they're not going to vote for the centrist no matter what. It's possible that that's it. And if that's the case, and perhaps that still is a difference of values, but it's also a tactical difference, perhaps there are assumptions underlying that strategy which can be, critiqued and disproven. For example, the idea that you can keep your hands clean in a bourgeois election or elect your way to the ascendancy of a socialist platform, or that you could even politic your way out of bourgeois democracy.
I also think that there might be a fair amount of people that aren't even aware that there's some sort of alternative ideologically to the sort of social democratic Jacobin, Sandinista, left populist, sort of narrow economism that we've been critiquing. Or at least maybe they might be aware that there are some sort of other groups and ideologies out there, but those ideas don't seem to have a viable purchase on events. They don't seem to be ways you can immediately get your hands dirty. I mean, people are attracted to things that are winning, things that are in their ascendancy, things that are cachet. So I can see how a young person could get swept up into the romanticism of the Sandinista movement, if you want to call it a movement. I shouldn't probably call it that. And I think they often don't run into things that make them question this orientation. At least things that are alternatives from the left, so things that are more to the left of the social democratic standpoint, are not things they run into that often. Honestly, I don't think it takes much to question this position, especially as like Jacobin has become more and more of like a parody of itself. It reads like some sort of propaganda magazine with its ridiculous accolades of Sanders. I mean, declaring the day after his heart attack that he's perfectly fine and in perfectly good health. I mean, it felt like some sort of Soviet propaganda newspaper. Or they're like ridiculous diatribes against Elizabeth Warren as if she is some sort of distinctive thing from Sanders. I mean, to me, they're both left economic populists, just that she calls herself a capitalist and he calls himself a socialist, but it's just sort of this difference in labeling. There's no substance to it. But at Jacobin, it means everything in this very religious, uncritical way. So I do think it is, possible to critique and maybe persuade people that this is an absurdist position to take if they see that there's some other alternative on the left. People, they don't want to opt for the center, and they don't want to opt for the right. Then, in addition to that, though, there is this line, right, that this left populism is the only way to defeat Trump. That the people are only going to be motivated to vote for a candidate again and oppose Trump if this Democratic candidate is representing something that's in their material interest. But then again, I think people who take that line really need to be challenged on the viability of this very narrow economistic perception of people's interests, and challenged to question a concept of socialism that is so narrowly focused on redistributionist economic policies at the expense of the fight against authoritarianism and downplaying the dangers of racism and white nationalism and Trumpism and et cetera. Adam, in your paper, you argue that it's important for socialists to fight to transcend liberal democracy, but you also argue that it's important to defend liberal democracy at the same time. Can you explain why that's not a contradiction, to try to fight to transcend something and to fight to defend it? And also, maybe you should even define what you mean by liberal democracy as opposed to just democracy in general.
So I don't think that it's a coincidence that socialism, as a political ideology and as a movement emerged from the bourgeois struggle for democracy and also from sectors of radical republicanism. And I believe that at a certain point in advancing the political question, that you therefore imply the social question. And there's three words I used in my talk that I really want to focus on: defend, extend, and transcend. I believe that we need to defend the protections of democracy, and in doing so, extend them in order to transcend them, to move beyond the boundaries of liberal democracy. And again, that quote from Lenin in 1905 really, I think, summarizes all of this. Quote, "We can vastly extend these boundaries, and within these boundaries we can and must fight for the interests of the proletariat, for its immediate needs and for the conditions that will make it possible to prepare its forces for the future complete victory." So it's not just important to defend liberal democracy against authoritarianism because authoritarianism is terrible and oppressive. In doing so, we can extend those protections. The fight to protect Obamacare has advanced the question of healthcare in this country, and the fight to abolish slavery advanced the question of the status of Black people in this country, because again, it absolutely advances the status of the question of Black people in this country when they go from being slaves to potentially owning land and running for office. And finally, the idea that we can transcend democracy, and finally, the idea that we can transcend democracy in the struggle against authoritarianism, I think is the most important part here. It means that there is a way in which we can struggle for democracy against authoritarianism that does not stop at the boundaries of liberal democracy, that can actually, create some sort of momentum, enact a process that could lead to a better society beyond liberal democracy and capitalism. And then finally, I have an anecdote about fair and free elections over in East Europe. This was, I forget when the election was. This was around 2011 or 2012, and it was when Putin was running for re-election. There was an independent watchdog group that set up webcams in the polling places. And so I was watching one for about a half hour, and the scene really stuck in my mind where I saw a little old Russian lady patiently waiting in line to cast her one single vote. And meanwhile, right in front of her in line was the guy who was running the polling station, stuffing the ballot for Putin, who won, I think, something like 95% of the vote in that district. So that's what a fair and free election is under illiberal democracy.
Well, thank you so much, Adam, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
That's all the time we have on today's episode of Radio Free Humanity. If you like the podcast, please do stop by Marxist-Humanist-Initiative.org to see more episodes, to leave a comment, to leave a donation. And if you appreciate the podcast, please do all those things, seemingly superficial things that help a podcast out. Like us on your podcast app or platform. Share us with your friends on social media or in person. And please do write in. We hope to hear from you.